So, we always talk about like the huge players in European betting.
Yeah.
The big ones, right?
Absolutely.
Well, today I thought it'd be fun to kind of go under the radar a little bit and check out some maybe less talked about, but potentially really lucrative markets in Central Europe.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Those big names get all the headlines, but I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff happening in these smaller nations that we don't always hear about.
Yeah, they don't need as much attention, but there's some really fascinating stuff happening there. And especially if you are someone who's interested in kind of understanding global market trends and maybe getting ahead of the curve.
Yeah.
This is a really good area, I think, to be paying attention to.
Yeah, and we've actually got a great source here that gives us a solid overview of betting markets and policies in several of these Central European countries.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, it talks about, the current state of these markets, what the potential is, what the regulations look like, what the tax structures look like.
Yeah, so it's a really good kind of 360-degree view of what's going on in these places. So our goal today is to really dig into this and kind of extract the key insights about Liechtenstein, Austria, Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic.
Yeah, and I think it'd be really interesting to see what makes each market unique and then, what that means for their potential future growth.
Exactly. And I think maybe starting off with Liechtenstein.
Okay.
So I think a lot of people probably don't even know where this country is. So for those who don't, it's a tiny little country nestled right between Switzerland and Austria.
Yep.
Very wealthy population, is only around 39,000 people.
Wow.
But it's a small city in a lot of places.
That's incredible. Yeah.
So very small, but surprisingly interesting when it comes to the betting world.
It is. And actually, it's interesting because Liechtenstein hasn't actually legislated or issued any licenses for online betting yet.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So no online betting, but physical casinos have been permitted since mid-2017. So there are currently 6 operating land-based casinos in Liechtenstein.
Wow. So they went from 0 to 6 pretty quickly.
They did.
Interesting.
Yeah. And I think this is something that your listeners will find really interesting is that, despite the fact there's no online betting, these land-based casinos are doing really well.
Wow.
Yeah, they're nearing 50 million euros in turnover in 2023.
Wow, that's a lot of money for such a small country.
It is, and they're really attributing this to kind of a tourism-based betting, right? So because it's right there between Germany, Switzerland, and Austria, people are coming across the border to play.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah, and what I think is really fascinating is that, even though they don't have online betting regulations, now Liechtenstein was actually a pioneer in the online gaming space.
Oh, really?
Yeah, back in 1995.
Long time ago.
Yeah, a long time ago, they launched Interlotto, which later became PLUS Lotto, which was actually the world's first officially licensed internet lottery.
Oh, wow, that's amazing. I did not know that.
Yeah, so it ran from 1995 to 2011, and it was a really big deal at the time.
Wow, so they were kind of ahead of their time in a way.
I think so, yeah, for sure.
Huh, interesting. And so what about on the kind of financial side of things? How are things taxed? How does that all work?
Yeah, so, because there are no online betting regulations yet, there are no specific taxes for online betting in Liechtenstein, but for the land-based casinos.
Right.
There are license fees and then revenue-based taxes, although the exact rates aren't really public knowledge.
Gotcha. So kind of a little bit of a mystery there.
Yeah, but what's interesting is that even without those online betting rules, Liechtenstein's got this history, right, as this early adopter of online lotteries.
Right.
And the fact that they've got these land-based casinos that are really thriving, driven by all these people coming across the border, I think it's a really interesting example of how gaming can flourish, even in these maybe unexpected situations.
Absolutely. Yeah. Very cool. Well, let's move on then to maybe a slightly bigger player here. Austria. So another German-speaking nation, very high standard of living, strong economy.
Yeah, Austria's interesting because they actually have a state-controlled monopoly on online lotteries and casino operations.
Okay.
And this is actually expected to continue until at least September 2027.
Oh, wow.
So we've got a little while to go with that, but there is a big exception, which is online sports betting.
Okay.
For that, licenses are issued at the state level, so there's not one kind of unified federal approach.
Interesting.
Yeah. And actually, live betting is prohibited in some Austrian states.
Oh, wow. That's a pretty big deal, because I feel like live betting is a huge part of the sports betting market nowadays.
It is. Yeah, it's a big part of it.
Yeah, so it's interesting that they've chosen to go that route.
It is. And I think, while it's partially open, that monopoly does limit how dynamic the market can be.
Yeah, for sure.
But the government is considering some reforms, and they're actually looking at the German model, which includes an independent regulator, and potentially increasing some tax rates. Yeah. So it's definitely something that the industry is watching closely.
Yeah, I bet. So how about regulations then? So if they're issued at a state level, what does that look like? Is it pretty varied, or is it pretty consistent?
It's pretty varied, yeah. So you see different standards and restrictions depending on which state you're in.
Gotcha.
Most states allow sports betting. Some allow betting on cultural or political events.
Interesting.
And like we said, the rules around live betting, they aren't consistent.
Gotcha. So you really have to know where you are and what the rules are there before you place any bets.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's really important to understand the local regulations.
For sure, for sure. And so then what about taxation? How does that all work in Austria?
Yeah, so there is a 2% turnover tax on sports betting, and then there might be some other fees depending on which state you're in.
Right.
And like we mentioned, the government is thinking about raising taxes and maybe making the regulations a bit more unified.
Right.
But for now, operators are looking at a tax on their gross gaming revenue, which ranges from 20% to 40%. Wow, that's pretty high.
It is, yeah, it's pretty high. And then on top of that, there's a 7.7% VAT on non-core tech services, and then potentially licensing fees, depending on the state.
So, yeah, there's a lot going on.
It's a complicated picture.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, so for listeners, Austria is definitely a market that is in transition.
Yeah.
They've got this monopoly that's in place, but it's not fully closed off.
Yeah.
And there's this potential for reforms to really shake things up.
Right.
So it'll be really interesting to see how that all unfolds.
Absolutely. I think it's definitely a market to watch.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's head east now to Hungary.
Okay.
Which is another Central Eastern European EU member, and they border both Austria and Slovakia.
Yeah, and Hungary is interesting because they've actually moved away from their state monopoly on betting relatively recently.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so for a long time there was a state monopoly, but in January 2023, they introduced a new betting law that ended that monopoly, which was called Szegyetek.
Okay.
And they've brought in a new licensing system. Gotcha.
To apply for a license, you need at least 5 years of licensing experience within the EEA, that's the European Economic Area. And you can't have any recent history of illegal betting activities.
So they're really making sure that you're a good actor before they'll let you in.
Absolutely. Yeah, they're looking for established operators.
So then what does the market look like now? Who actually has licenses?
Yeah, so right now the licenses are mainly held by the former state monopoly and then 3 local land-based casinos.
Interesting. So still not a ton of competition?
Not yet, no.
Okay.
But it's not totally open to overseas operators yet either.
Gotcha.
But that is something that's expected to change in the future.
Okay, so more potential for growth there.
Definitely, yeah.
Cool. And then in terms of regulation, how does that work in Hungary?
So the main regulatory body is called SCTFH, which is the National Tax and Customs Administration.
Okay.
They focus on technical compliance, making sure your funding sources are legitimate, advertising practices, and consumer protection.
Okay, so the big ones.
Yeah, and there's a really interesting new development, which is that players can now register multiple online accounts.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, previously they were limited to just one, so that's a big change.
So they're definitely opening things up a little bit more.
Yeah, they are.
That's cool. And how about taxes? How does that work?
Yeah, so you've got an application fee, which is about 26,000 euros.
Okay.
You need a certain amount of registered capital.
Okay.
There's an operating license fee.
Okay.
A 2.5% supervision fee, which is capped at about 10,000.
Okay.
And then a 15% tax on your gross revenue.
So quite a few different fees there.
Yeah, it's a pretty detailed framework.
Yeah, for sure. But I mean, the big takeaway here is that Hungary's really opening up.
Yeah.
Moving away from that monopoly. So, for operators out there who have experience, who have that good track record, this would be a really good place to get in.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think as they continue to liberalize the market, there's going to be even more opportunity.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, let's shift over to Slovakia now.
Okay.
Another Central European country, and this one borders Ukraine and Austria.
Yeah, and Slovakia actually has a really rich Central Eastern European cultural heritage.
Cool.
Yeah, and they've also moved away from a government monopoly with a new gambling act that came into effect in January of 2023.
Okay.
And now private companies can actually apply for different online betting licenses.
Okay.
And it's all part of this bigger push towards digital transformation in Slovakia.
Interesting. Okay, cool. And so has that kind of opening up of the market gotten a lot of attention?
Yeah, it definitely has.
Okay.
We've seen international operators showing a lot of interest.
Yeah.
But it's not without its challenges.
Okay, what kinds of challenges?
Well, the licensing structures can be pretty complex.
Okay.
And there are some pretty strict advertising restrictions as well.
Gotcha.
So you have to be really careful about how you market your products.
For sure.
But it seems like the government is really trying to find a balance between protecting consumers and encouraging businesses to operate legally.
Yeah, you got to strike that balance, right?
Exactly.
Well, that's good. And so who is the regulatory body in Slovakia?
Yeah, so that's the Office for the Regulation of Gambling.
Okay.
And they're an independent body that's responsible for licensing,
Right.
compliance, and blacklisting.
Okay, so they do it all.
Yeah, they've got a lot of responsibility.
And what about the advertising rules?
Right.
What are some specifics there?
Yeah, so you can't target ads at minors
Right.
or other vulnerable groups.
Okay.
There are time limits on when you can show ads.
Gotcha.
You have to include responsible gambling information in all your advertising.
Okay.
And actually, there's even talk of a complete ban on betting advertisements in the future.
Wow, so that's pretty intense.
It is, yeah, it's pretty restrictive.
Yeah, wow. And then taxes, what's the situation there?
Yeah, so Slovakia uses a GGR-based tax model,
Okay.
and that's a gross gaming revenue. So online betting operators pay 22%.
Okay.
Land-based operators, except for casinos, pay 6%.
Okay.
And then land-based casinos pay 27%.
Okay.
Plus an extra 3% that goes to the municipality where they're located.
Gotcha. So they split it up.
Yeah, they do. And it's worth mentioning that there are some potential VAT exemptions, but it really depends on the specifics of your business.
Gotcha. So the key takeaway here is that, Slovakia is being proactive about opening up the market.
Yeah.
But the regulations are changing all the time.
Yeah.
And those advertising restrictions are definitely something to keep a close eye on.
Absolutely. If you want to succeed in Slovakia, you need to be on top of those regulations.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, then let's wrap up our deep dive here by taking a look at the Czech Republic.
Okay, sounds good.
So the Central European, EU, and Schengen member state, very strong economy.
Yeah, the Czech Republic is really interesting because they were actually one of the first countries in Central Eastern Europe to legalize their betting market.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so their gambling act has been enforced since 2017.
Okay.
And it sets out some pretty strict rules for how operators have to run their businesses. And it also introduced a licensing system for a whole bunch of different online gaming products.
Okay, so they've had some time to kind of figure things out.
Yeah, exactly. They're kind of ahead of the game in that way.
So then what does the market look like now? Is it pretty stable? Is there a lot of growth happening?
Yeah, I would say the market is pretty stable at the moment, but it looks like it's got some real potential for breakout growth.
Okay, why is that?
Well, in 2023, they introduced some regulatory reforms.
Okay.
And these reforms are really focused on three main things.
Okay, what are those?
So first, they want to strengthen player protection.
Okay.
And they've done that by introducing things like a panic button.
A panic button? What's that?
Yeah, so it's basically a way for players to instantly exclude themselves from gambling for 48 hours.
Wow, that's really interesting.
Yeah, it's a really great tool for people who are struggling with gambling addiction.
Absolutely.
They've also enhanced their self-exclusion tools. So players can now choose to exclude themselves for longer periods of time.
Gotcha. So they're really taking that seriously.
Absolutely. Yeah. Player protection is a big priority for them.
That's good. And what's the second thing?
So the second thing is they're trying to fight illegal betting more effectively.
Okay. How are they doing that?
Well, they've expanded their blacklist,
Okay.
which makes it easier to target unlicensed operators.
Gotcha.
And they've also restricted partnerships with unlicensed affiliates.
Okay, so really clamping down.
Yeah, exactly. They're really trying to make sure that everyone's playing by the rules.
And the third thing?
So the third thing is that they've expanded their range of legal product offerings.
Okay, like what?
Well, specifically, they've added support for live casino games.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Yeah, so that's a really popular form of online gambling.
Yeah, For sure.
It's a big move for them.
Yeah, and I mean, it sounds like online betting is pretty popular in the Czech Republic.
Yeah, it's huge.
Yeah.
They've seen double-digit annual growth for a while now. And in 2023, their total betting revenue exceeded 1 billion euros.
Wow, that's a lot.
It is, yeah, and over 50% of that came from online platforms.
Wow, so they've got a really strong online presence.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's really cool. And so how do those new regulations actually work in practice?
Yeah, so we talked about the panic button,
right,
which is a really innovative feature.
Yeah.
They've also broadened the definition of operating within the territory for blacklisting purposes.
Okay, so what does that mean?
So basically it means that it's easier for them to target operators who are trying to offer their services to Czech players without a license.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah, and they've also clamped down on those partnerships with unlicensed affiliates.
Right.
So really sending a message that you need to be licensed to operate in the Czech Republic.
So yeah, they're really serious about this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then in terms of taxes, what's the situation there?
Yeah, so in the Czech Republic, betting companies pay standard corporate income tax, and they also have to cover certain compliance-related technical costs.
Gotcha.
Which all adds up to what's been described as a high-tax, strong regulation environment.
So it's not the easiest place to operate, but it sounds like it's working pretty well.
Yeah, I think it is. They've got a well-established system.
Yeah.
And they're clearly committed to doing things the right way.
Yeah, for sure. So for our listeners, you know, the Czech Republic is a more mature market than some of the others we've talked about.
Yeah.
The regulations are really well defined.
Yeah.
And they're really focused on protecting players.
Right.
So it's a good example of a market that's growing, but doing so in a really responsible way.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, awesome. Well, so that was a whirlwind tour of 5 really interesting Central European betting markets.
It was, yeah. We covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, we did. And I think, you know, one of the big takeaways is that we're seeing this general trend towards more open policies in the region.
Absolutely.
A lot of these countries have moved away from state monopolies, and they're putting in place these, you know, sophisticated regulatory frameworks and these really well-defined tax structures.
Right.
So these might not be the biggest markets in Europe, but I think they're definitely ones to watch.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, for anyone who's interested in really understanding how global betting markets work,
right,
I think these countries offer a really fascinating case study.
Yeah.
We can see how they're liberalizing their markets.
Yeah.
How they're developing the regulations.
All right.
And I think there's a lot of potential there for operators who can really get a handle on those evolving landscapes.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, and I think that brings us to a final thought here for our listeners to kind of ponder.
Okay.
So, you know, we've looked at all these different approaches to regulating and taxing betting in Liechtenstein, Austria, Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic.
Right.
So what do you think is the most effective model, you know, for promoting both economic development and responsible gaming?
Right.
Because you got to do both, right?
Absolutely.
So how do you strike that balance?
Yeah, that's a really important question.
Yeah, and especially for emerging markets around the world.
Yeah.
You know, what can they learn from these 5 countries that we've talked about today?
It's a great question, and I think it's one that we're going to continue to grapple with as the global betting market continues to evolve.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, that's a great place to leave it then.
Okay.
So until next time, happy betting, everybody.
Yeah, see you later.